A single father walked quietly into the final hearing that would decide whether he kept the pension he had spent 20 years earning at one of the largest airlines in the country. The company's lawyer stood with total confidence and announced that every benefit owed to him had been voided because of an internal clause nobody had ever bothered to notice before. Around the table, executives nodded along, already certain the matter was closed and the man across from them had no way to fight back. Just as the room settled into that quiet, self-satisfied silence, the door at the far end swung open without warning. His daughter stepped through it, carrying an old cardboard box in her arms, and the entire leadership team went still. What was hidden inside that small box that made an entire airline pay for what it had done? Stay with this story until the very end. David Carter was 45 years old, and for most of his adult life he had been the kind of man other people quietly relied on without ever saying so out loud. He had spent nearly 22 years as an aircraft maintenance engineer for one of the country's largest airlines, the kind of job where a single overlooked bolt could cost lives. And David had never once let that responsibility slip through his fingers. He was not a loud man. He rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, and the mechanics who had trained under him still called him for advice years after he had left the hangar floor. There was a steadiness to him that people trusted instinctively, the sort of trust that gets built slowly across decades of showing up and doing the work right, not the kind that can be bought or faked. Years earlier, a serious accident on the tarmac had left him with permanent injuries to his hip and his hearing, and the airline itself had processed his early retirement under its disability program, signing off on every form with the seal of a company that seemed, at the time, genuinely grateful for his service. He had walked out of that hangar for the last time believing the promise the company had made him was solid, that the pension he had spent 2 decades building would carry him and his daughter through whatever came next. Now he lived simply in a modest house on the edge of town, driving a truck that was older than some of the interns at his former employer's corporate headquarters. He was not a wealthy man and had never tried to be one. His entire financial life rested on that pension check arriving every month, the number he had built his retirement, his mortgage, and his daughter's future around. His only child, Jessica Carter, was 19 years old and away at college most of the year, chasing a degree in early childhood education and calling home only when she had a free hour between classes and her part-time job at the campus library. She barely appeared in the early chapters of what was about to happen to her father, absorbed as she was in exams and dorm life 2 states away, unaware that the quiet stability she had grown up with was about to be threatened by people she had never met and would never have reason to trust. David had raised her alone since she was 7 years old, after her mother passed away following a long illness, and in the years since he had learned to build an entire household around routine, patience, and a kind of quiet discipline that never asked for recognition. He packed her school lunches himself every morning before his early shifts at the hangar, sat through parent-teacher conferences in his work uniform because there was rarely time to change, and never once let her see how tired he actually was after a double shift spent crawling through the belly of an aircraft checking wiring harnesses by flashlight. The men and women who had worked beside him for 2 decades remembered him less for any single accomplishment and more for 1,000 small ones. The times he stayed late without being asked to double-check a colleague's work, the way he trained 3 generations of younger mechanics without ever taking credit for their later successes, the calm, unhurried voice he used even during emergencies on the tarmac when everyone around him was moving too fast to think clearly. That reputation had followed him out the door the day he retired, though David himself rarely thought about it, too focused on the quiet, ordinary work of raising his daughter and keeping their small household running on a fixed income that, until recently, he had never once had reason to doubt. On the other side of this story stood a very different kind of person, a woman named Margaret Brooks, 54 years old, recently installed as the airline's vice president of human resources after a merger reshuffled the company's entire executive suite. Margaret had built her reputation on a single skill, the ability to find money hiding inside a balance sheet that other executives were too sentimental or too cautious to touch. Her newest initiative, quietly rolled out under a name so bland it barely drew attention in internal memos, targeted hundreds of older pension agreements signed decades earlier under looser corporate rules. The justification she gave the board was simple and, to her, entirely sufficient. These obligations were dragging down quarterly profits, and profits were what kept her chair at the table. She did not know David Carter's name when she approved the list that included his file, and she did not particularly care to learn it. To her, he was a line item, one of hundreds, a number that needed to shrink so a bigger number could grow. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, tucked between a phone bill and a grocery store flyer, and David almost didn't open it right away. When he finally did, 3 words near the top of the page stopped him cold. Pension benefits terminated. He read the letter twice, then a third time, searching for some explanation buried in the corporate language. But there was nothing there except a case number and a suggestion that he contact the benefits department if he had questions. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time that evening, the letter flat in front of him under the overhead light, trying to understand how 22 years of work could be erased by a single paragraph typed up by someone he had never met. The following morning, David drove to the regional office and asked to speak with someone in human resources, expecting a simple misunderstanding that a phone call or two could clear up. Instead, he found himself standing at the beginning of a maze that seemed designed to exhaust him rather than help him. The woman at the front desk in human resources told him his case belonged to legal. The man in legal told him it belonged to benefits. The clerk in benefits insisted the matter now sat with compliance, and compliance simply forwarded him back to human resources, where a different employee looked at his S-file as though she had never seen it before. Weeks passed this way, David driving back and forth between departments, filling out the same forms twice, sometimes 3 times, each visit ending with a polite apology and no actual answer. He kept a small notebook in his truck where he wrote down the date, the department, and the name of whoever he had spoken with that day, a habit built from decades of documenting his work on aircraft, where sloppy records could cost someone their life. Eventually, a company lawyer named Christian Blake agreed to meet him directly, and for the first time David received something resembling a real explanation, though it was not one that made any sense to him. According to Christian, a clause buried in an old internal policy rendered David's original retirement paperwork technically invalid, a clerical inconsistency that had apparently gone unnoticed for over 15 years until someone in the new administration happened to flag it during an unrelated audit. Because of that supposed inconsistency, the airline considered itself under no obligation to continue paying him anything at all. David sat across the desk from Christian, a man in an expensive suit who would not quite meet his eyes, and felt something harden inside his chest. He knew with the same certainty he had once felt checking a hydraulic line before signing off on a flight that something about this was deeply wrong. But knowing something is wrong and being able to prove it in a room full of corporate lawyers are 2 very different problems, and David did not have the money to hire an attorney capable of fighting a company with that much legal firepower behind it. Somewhere in a conference room he would never see, Margaret Brooks and the rest of the leadership team had already made their calculation, confident that a quiet, tired man from the maintenance hangar would simply give up rather than fight a battle he had no visible way of winning. Rather than give up, David did something the airline had not accounted for. He started asking questions on his own time, in his own way, the same patient, methodical way he had once traced electrical faults through miles of aircraft wiring. He began reaching out to old coworkers, men and women he had worked alongside for years, some retired, some still on the job, careful not to make his calls sound like anything more than a friend checking in. What he found unsettled him more than his own letter had. Several of these former colleagues, all retired around the same years he had received nearly identical letters citing the very same vague internal clause, and each of them had reacted the way people often do when a powerful institution tells them they no longer matter. They had assumed it was simply the price of getting old, an unfortunate but unchallengeable fact of corporate life, and none of them had thought to compare notes with anyone else. One name kept surfacing in these conversations, a man named Samuel Reed, who had spent nearly 3 decades managing the airline's technical archives before retiring himself 2 years earlier. David drove out to see him on a Saturday afternoon, and over coffee at Samuel's kitchen table, the old records manager listened to David's story with a stillness that told David he already suspected something. Samuel admitted quietly and with visible discomfort that in his final year on the job he had noticed irregularities in how certain older personnel files were being accessed and modified, changes that came through without the usual chain of approvals he had spent his career enforcing. He had raised concerns at the time and been told, gently but firmly, that it was not his department's business anymore. Now hearing David's story, Samuel agreed to help however he could, though he warned David that whoever was behind this had almost certainly covered their tracks well. Somebody, Samuel said, is erasing history, and doing it carefully enough that most people would never notice unless they went looking the way David now was. That conversation planted a seed of suspicion that would not leave David alone. This was not simply a clerical mistake affecting one unlucky retiree. It was beginning to look like a pattern, deliberate and organized, reaching far beyond his own file into the records of men and women who had given decades of their lives to the same company and now had no idea their retirement security was quietly being dismantled behind closed doors. Over the following weeks, David built a simple spreadsheet on an old laptop Jessica had left behind before heading back to campus, listing every retiree he had spoken with, the year each of them had left the company, and the exact wording used in the letters they had received. The pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore once it was laid out in black and white. Every single letter cited the same obscure internal clause. Everyone had been sent within a narrow window of only a few months, and every recipient had retired under the same disability or early retirement program that David himself had used decades earlier. He began driving longer distances on weekends, sometimes 2 or 3 hours each way, to sit across kitchen tables from men he barely remembered and women who had once brought him coffee during night shifts, listening to each of them describe the same confusion, the same dead-end phone calls, the same quiet resignation settling over people who had simply assumed the company knew what it was doing. Several of them, ashamed and exhausted, admitted they had already stopped fighting entirely, certain that nothing could be done against an organization with that much money and that many lawyers. David never told them what to do. He only asked if he could write down what had happened to them, in his own notebook, in his own handwriting, the same careful documentation habit that had kept aircraft safe for over 20 years now turned toward keeping a different kind of record altogether. David filed a formal internal appeal, carefully documenting everything Samuel had told him along with his own notes from months of dead-end phone calls, and the response came back within days, denied with no explanation beyond a boilerplate reference to policy compliance. He appealed again and again received the same hollow rejection, each one seemingly generated faster than the last, as though someone had simply built a template for saying no to him specifically. Christian Blake, the company's lawyer, proved a master of delay. Requesting additional documentation only to claim it had arrived incomplete, scheduling meetings only to cancel them at the last possible hour, always polite, always apologetic, and always somehow moving the process backward instead of forward. Friends who had known David for years began gently suggesting he simply accept what had happened and move on, telling him that fighting a company that size was like punching at fog, exhausting and ultimately pointless. The financial pressure grew heavier by the month. David sold his old fishing boat first, then the second vehicle he had kept for hauling tools, watching his small savings account shrink a little further every time a mortgage payment or a utility bill came due. He stopped buying anything that wasn't strictly necessary, learned to make a single grocery trip stretch further than it should have, and lay awake some nights running numbers in his head that never quite balanced, no matter how many times he recalculated them. Jessica called occasionally from campus, her voice bright and busy with the ordinary concerns of a college sophomore, and David found himself unable to tell her the full truth, saying only that things at home were a little tight for now, not wanting to hand his daughter a burden she couldn't fix from 300 miles away. She had no idea how close to the edge her father had actually come, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as he possibly could. Back at the airline's headquarters, Margaret Brooks reviewed the quarterly savings from the pension initiative and felt nothing but satisfaction at the numbers on her screen, while David Carter, one line among hundreds on that same spreadsheet, kept fighting in ways she never bothered to notice. The internal hearing that would formally decide David's case was scheduled on a gray morning in a conference room on the airline's 14th floor, a room lined with framed photographs of aircraft from decades past, the kind of place built to remind visitors exactly how large and permanent the company considered itself. David arrived alone, in the same worn blazer he had worn to his daughter's high school graduation, because there was no one else to bring and no money left to hire someone who might have stood beside him. Christian Blake sat at the head of the table with a thick binder open in front of him, flanked by 2 junior attorneys and a court reporter typing quietly in the corner, everything arranged with the practiced choreography of people who had done this many times before and expected no surprises today either. Christian walked the room through his prepared case point by point, citing the internal policy clause, the supposed defect in David's original retirement paperwork, and a stack of meeting minutes that appeared on their surface to support every claim the company had made from the beginning. Every document he raised seemed to tilt the room further against David, and the executives seated around the table began exchanging small, satisfied glances, the kind of look shared between people who believe a difficult problem is finally about to be resolved in their favor. Someone near the far end of the table quietly gathered a stack of papers together, a small gesture that made it clear the group considered the outcome already settled and the vote merely a formality left to complete. David sat through all of it without interrupting, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his face giving away nothing of what was happening inside him. When Christian finally finished and asked, almost as a courtesy, whether David had anything to add before the panel moved to a vote, David looked up and spoke for the first time in nearly 40 minutes. "I only have one question," he said, his voice steady despite everything riding on the next few moments. The room waited, and David asked simply why the original approval documents from his retirement, the ones signed by the executives who had processed his disability retirement decades earlier, were never included anywhere in the file now being used to strip his benefits away. Nobody at the table answered him. Christian glanced down at his binder as though the response might be hiding somewhere inside it, and for a long, uncomfortable moment nobody in the room said a single word. The silence stretched on, heavy and strange, until the sound of the conference room door opening broke it completely. Every head in the room turned at once. Standing in the doorway was Jessica Carter, still wearing her travel clothes from the drive back from campus, her hair slightly windblown, cradling a battered cardboard box against her hip as though it weighed far more than it looked like it should. She had come straight from the parking garage without stopping, having called her father's phone twice with no answer, and finally, following an instinct she couldn't fully explain even to herself, driven directly to the building where she somehow knew the hearing was taking place that morning. David rose halfway out of his chair, more confused than anyone else in the room, unsure whether to feel relief or alarm at the sight of his daughter standing there with executives staring at her like she had walked in from another world entirely. Jessica crossed the room and set the box down on the table in front of her father, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from nerves or the weight of the box itself was hard to say. She explained, a little breathlessly, that while helping clear out her grandmother's old storage unit the previous weekend, sorting through decades of family belongings that nobody had touched in years, she had found this box pushed far into a back corner, its cardboard sides soft with age and its lid held shut with brittle tape that crumbled the moment she touched it. Inside were things David himself had forgotten still existed. A worn leather-bound work journal filled with his own handwriting from his years on the hangar floor, several handwritten letters of commendation from supervisors who had long since retired themselves, a yellowed photocopy of his original disability retirement decision bearing a signature block full of names nobody in this room recognized anymore, and, tucked beneath a folded stack of old company newsletters, an external hard drive with a strip of masking tape across it that simply read, in David's own faded handwriting, "Work backup, do not erase." For a moment David simply stared at his daughter, at the dust still clinging to the knees of her jeans, and the determined set of her jaw that reminded him so much of her mother, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in months. He asked her quietly how she had even known where to find him, and Jessica admitted she hadn't been entirely sure, that she had simply driven straight from the storage unit to his house, found it empty, and remembered him once mentioning offhand, weeks earlier on a phone call she almost hadn't paid attention to, that his hearing was scheduled for this week at the downtown office tower. She had guessed the floor from the directory in the lobby and walked in without an appointment, without a badge, without anyone's permission, propelled by nothing more than a daughter's instinct that her father needed her exactly then. Nobody in the room moved as Jessica pulled the hard drive free and set it gently on the table beside the box. One of the junior attorneys finally cleared his throat and suggested, carefully, that a laptop could be brought in to examine its contents right there, and after a brief, tense exchange of glances among the executives, someone reluctantly agreed. The drive, when finally connected, revealed folder after folder of years-old email correspondence, records David had quietly backed up himself out of the same instinct for documentation that had served him his entire career. Among the thousands of files sat exactly what David had spent months searching for and never found through official channels. An email chain in which the airline's own retirement committee, under a different leadership entirely, had formally and explicitly approved his disability retirement with full pension benefits, followed by a second chain in which the legal department of that earlier era confirmed in writing that his benefits were guaranteed for life under the terms of his original agreement. The conference room, filled only minutes earlier with the quiet confidence of people who believed they had already won, went completely and utterly silent. The discovery of Jessica's box did not end the matter that morning so much as it cracked the door open on something far larger than anyone in that conference room had anticipated. Within days, the airline's board authorized an independent forensic review of its personnel records systems, partly to determine what had actually happened in David's case, and partly, though nobody said this out loud, to control the damage before it spread any further. The technical team brought in to conduct the review moved carefully through the company's servers, comparing timestamps, access logs, and file histories with the kind of patience David himself would have appreciated from his old maintenance days. And what they found matched almost exactly what Samuel Reed had quietly suspected 2 years earlier. Dozens of older personnel files, David's among them, had been accessed and edited well outside the normal channels, stripped of key approval documents and altered in ways clearly designed to make long-settled retirement agreements appear questionable or incomplete. The digital trail, though partially covered, was not covered well enough, and it led investigators directly back to authorization requests originating from Margaret Brooks's own office, requests she had signed off on as part of what she had internally described in her own notes as a benefits optimization initiative. The scale of it stunned even the investigators. This was not an isolated mistake affecting one unlucky retiree. It was a coordinated effort touching more than 100 former employees, men and women who had spent decades of their working lives keeping aircraft safe in the sky, all of them targeted quietly and systematically to protect a set of quarterly numbers on a spreadsheet. Word of the investigation reached a financial reporter within a week, and from there the story moved quickly beyond the airline's ability to contain it. Headlines began appearing about the airline accused of stripping pensions from veteran employees through altered records, and shareholders who had trusted the leadership team to manage the company responsibly were suddenly asking very different, much sharper questions about what else that team might have quietly manipulated in the name of protecting profit. Samuel Reed, watching the story unfold from his kitchen table where he had first warned David that someone was erasing history, finally agreed to speak on the record with investigators, providing dates, file names, and details of the irregular access patterns he had noticed years earlier but had been too cautious, or too afraid, to report through official channels at the time. His testimony, combined with the forensic data pulled from the company's own servers, gave the review committee something no amount of corporate polish could talk its way around. A clear, documented timeline showing exactly when the altered files had been touched, by which department and under whose authorization. Board members who had approved Margaret's cost-saving initiatives, without asking many questions, now found themselves reviewing the same emails investigators had uncovered, growing visibly uncomfortable as they realized how little scrutiny they themselves had applied. Before signing off on a program that saved the company money by quietly erasing promises made to people who could no longer speak for themselves in any boardroom. The fallout arrived swiftly once the pressure became public and undeniable. Margaret Brooks was suspended pending a full review of her conduct, escorted from the building on a Thursday afternoon, while employees who had once nodded politely in her presence now watched, in silence, from the hallways. Christian Blake, facing his own scrutiny for how aggressively he had defended a position he must have known was built on falsified paperwork, resigned from the company within the month, rather than face a formal inquiry into his own role in the affair. Under mounting public and shareholder pressure, the airline's remaining leadership announced it would restore full pension benefits to every affected retiree, David Carter included, along with back payments covering every month of benefits that had been wrongfully withheld. A formal public apology followed, along with a supplemental compensation package intended to make amends for the financial hardship the company's own actions had caused. David read the announcement online, alone in his kitchen, in the same chair where he had first read the letter that started everything, and felt strangely little in the way of triumph. When a local reporter eventually reached him for comment, David kept his response short, almost reluctant, the words of a man who had never wanted to be the center of anyone's story in the first place. "What I wanted was never the money," he told her, his voice quiet but certain. "I only wanted the promise they made me to be kept." In the weeks that followed, Dozens of other retirees who had quietly accepted their own termination letters, believing there was nothing left to be done, came forward once they heard what had happened, and one by one their benefits were reviewed and restored as well. An entire generation of retired workers finally given back what had been taken from them without warning or explanation. Several months later, David returned to the airport, not through the employee entrance he had walked through for over 20 years, but through the main terminal, dressed in a blazer that fit him a little better than the one he had worn to that final hearing. He was not there to work. He had been invited to a ceremony honoring longtime employees, a modest gathering held in a conference room not unlike the one where his case had once nearly ended in defeat, though this time the mood in the room could not have been more different. Jessica sat near the back, close enough to see her father clearly, having driven home from campus specifically for the occasion, though this time she stayed quietly in her seat, letting the moment belong to him rather than stepping into it herself. A representative from the airline stood at the front of the room and, before a small audience of former colleagues, presented David with an honorary service medallion, formally recognizing his decades of dedication to aircraft safety and the integrity he had shown even when the company itself had failed to show him any in return. Several of the other retirees whose benefits had been restored were there too, seated in folding chairs along the back wall, and more than one of them caught David's eye across the room and offered a small, private nod, the kind exchanged only between people who understood exactly what the other had been through. Samuel Reed had driven in from 3 counties over just to see it happen, standing quietly near the coffee table afterward, refusing anything more than a simple handshake when David tried to thank him properly for everything he had risked to help. Later that same week, a framed photograph of David in his younger years, standing proudly beside an aircraft he had personally serviced, was hung in the airline's technical training center, where new mechanics would pass it every day on their way to class, most of them never knowing the full story behind the quiet man in the picture. On the drive home that evening, Jessica asked her father, almost shyly, whether he was finally going to rest now that everything had been set right, and David just smiled and told her that rest had never really been the point, that all he had ever wanted was for the years he'd given to mean something, and for the people who came after him to trust that a promise made was still a promise worth keeping. Somewhere behind that framed photograph lived a truth worth remembering, one that David himself had lived through and would never need to say out loud. Dignity can be buried under false paperwork and quiet corporate decisions made in rooms far from the people they affect. But the truth has a way of finding someone willing to carry it forward, and sometimes the person who finally brings that truth into the light is not a lawyer or an investigator at all, but the very person we spend our whole lives trying hardest to protect.